Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's Writing Community Chat Show on a Wednesday. We have 2 shows a week, Wednesday and a Friday. It's fantastic to make it to the middle part of the week, which is always fun. A great milestone for us all. And we are 2 hours early today, which is interesting for us, very interesting. And we normally start at 8. And of course, it's 6 o'clock in the UK. So very interesting. If you are watching now, please engage and have a good chat in the chat room. And if you are listening back on the podcast, thank you very much. Chris is with me, and Chris, you don't know this, but the stats on the podcast today, after our show on Friday, in fact, and Sunday we had a show, it's gone through the roof a little bit.
Wow,
we've had a big spurt.
Like it. I don't know if I like the phrase "we've had a big spurt," but yeah, I like the fact that more people are listening to the show. That's good.
What can I say? Yeah, it's been,
anything
it's been
but
good.
spurt. You could say anything but spurt.
Hello. Yes, hello. Anyway, I'm glad to be here, and we're not far from the weekend as well, which is always fun. It's not like I'm counting away the days or anything. I mean, it may have something to do with the fact we're in a pandemic kind of thing, but that also links very nicely to the guests we have on the show today.
It does.
Yeah. But how are you anyway? How have you been since the weekend?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we saw each other on Monday because we did a show on Monday as well, and we've got a show next Monday as well. So we are busy over at the Writing Community Chat Show at the moment, and we're booked up until the end of May,
which is incredible.
Literally, we've got guests. I'm talking to guests and liaising with guests at the minute, and I'm like, yeah, June you're looking at?
We haven't got to the point where we're turning guests away, Chris, surely.
No, definitely. Well, we've got to the point where we're going maybe in June, which is quite crazy. Hello, yeah. Mr. Young.
Yes, indeed. Well, that is crazy considering that, we're certainly getting booked up. But let's get on with today's show. And first of all, as always, we start with the Be a Token book promotion, Chris. And do you want to?
Yeah, I'm going to do this week's Be a Token book promotion because, I feel like it's a great book. Actually, I've read it, and I've read the second book in the series. So it's a little known book called Deep: The Climb of Truth, and you can see it there at the bottom. This book had me gripped from the beginning to the very end. It's available in paperback, Kindle, and audiobook as well. So check that out because it's definitely worth. The narrator for that was fantastic. I've seen a little snippet. It's from someone called C.J. Agate. Never heard of him, but the book's pretty good. So I'm going to read the description. A young woman named Dee steps into a world of discovery and fear. Having been brought up isolated from civilization, she is separate from her father and her so-called home. She sets out on a journey through a world of danger and mystery, risking everything to stay alive and reunite with her father, Eli. Eli, who leads a secret life, entwined in dark and dangerous military experiments that threaten human existence. And this is a review. So it says, just how dismal can it be to discover right in the middle of a town slowly being engulfed by flames and almost invincible zombies that every single bit of your life has been a lie. So it does sound like a very good book, and I can vouch for it. I've read it, and it's pretty good. And the second one is also pretty good. And the cover looks fantastic as well, which I think we're going to see up there. Oh, yes, there it is. Beautiful.
I can't help, Chris, but when you talk about things like that, I just picture Art Attack in my head. You know, the way he calmly speaks about the drawings.
He did a lot of, surely, I should have got some clothes out and just sort of put them all over the place, and big reveal, which was your cover at the end.
Well, the reason, guys, thank you for that as well, Chris. It was very well done. That I'm pushing my book, which I don't always do. And ironically, in the chat, Linda says, I may have heard of that one. Lol. And is Huli Agate's secretary? Yes, he is.
I'm very underpaid. Please help me.
Yeah. But I'm pushing it because I'm stuck on 49 reviews, and I want that 50th. So if people could look into that and pick it up, that would be fantastic. So please do support the authors and support the show, which is me today. Anyway, that's embarrassing, so let's get rid of that. So today's guest, Chris, I understand you're very excited.
I am. Today's guest wrote a book, obviously. That's why she's on the show. But her book is my favourite read of the year so far. I know we're only 4 months in, but it's right up there with some of the best books I've read. So I'm really excited to have her on the show. And it's absolutely fantastic. And the cover is great as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
It is indeed. So today's guest, who is that, you might ask? And if you've seen the link to the show, you'll know exactly who that is. But today's guest is the author of The End of Men, which Chris Hooley just proudly presented there, which has been called the must-read debut of 2021 that everyone's talking about. And some of the praise has come from incredible guests, some of which we've had on the show: Ian Rankin, Paula Hawkins, AJ Flynn, so many more, and all the big presses and stuff, of course. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Christina Sweeney-Baird. Hello, welcome. It's so nice to have you on the show, and we thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm completely thrilled to hear that it's like up there with one of your top reads of the year. Very, very exciting. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. And, I found it was so relatable, because obviously we're going to talk about it in a second anyway, but it is about a pandemic. And I'll let you divulge on that in a second. But you'd think that at the moment, you think, why, I wouldn't want to read about a pandemic. But as soon as I picked the book up, I was just instantly hooked into it. And things felt so much like, it felt so immersive and so real that I think that just added to the brilliance of the story, to be honest. So yeah, it was very good.
Amazing. So the first thing we love to do on the show, Christina, obviously we're going to get you to talk about your book very shortly, because people might not have heard of this. They might have just tuned in and might want to, or listening back, and might want to know what it is about before we delve into the facts and perhaps the stories behind it. But the first thing we love to do is, how did you get into writing first? And what was the transition between what your life was and then suddenly looking for an agent and then pursuing that sort of career?
Yeah, so I always, as I think lots of writers have, always liked kind of writing on the side. Like, I liked writing essays, and I tried to write at the beginnings of novels when I was in my teens, and kind of did that all the way through. And I remember I took a gap year before I went to university, and I was like, I'm going to write a novel, and then kind of tapped out about 10,000 words. And I always felt really bad about the fact that I couldn't seem to finish a novel. I was like, God, I really want to write, but I can't finish one. And with hindsight, I just didn't know enough. And I do say that to people now. If you find yourself consistently kind of hitting a limit at, like, 10, 15, 20,000 words, you might just need to kind of read more, learn more, until your brain can kind of sustain a narrative. So I then studied law at uni rather than English, which I actually think was quite helpful, because I sustained the love of reading and I didn't have to read. So I kind of read as a treat. And then I started working as a lawyer when I was 23. So I'd kind of had, by this point, like 8-ish years of trying to write a novel, not managing it. And I thought, right, this is it. I'm going to do it. I'm not studying anymore. Ironically, I kind of had the mental bandwidth and a bit more time once I wasn't studying anymore. And the irony of saying, I started working as a lawyer in the city, and then I had the time to write a novel. But genuinely, that's kind of how it worked for me. And I said, right, I'm going to finish a novel by the end of my training contract. So I gave myself 2 years, thought it's fine, it won't take me 2 years. It did. It absolutely took me 2 years. And I really committed to it. And to be clear, that was a novel that was not The End of Man. That was a novel that I finished. It was a historical novel. And again, I make a point of saying that to people, because I think it's a rare author whose first manuscript actually gets them an agent, gets them published. So I kind of basically learned how to write a novel by writing a novel. I lost the plot with it many times, both in the kind of emotional literary sense, all kinds of different, directions. But it felt so good to have finished a novel after so many years of trying. And I had the idea of The End of Men while I was writing that book. And I remember thinking immediately when I had the idea of The End of Men, like, that's it. Like, that's the book. That's the book that's going to be published. This one I'm writing now, I don't think it's going to cut it, but I really wanted to finish the manuscript and done that. So I finished it. Took me another 6 months, and then literally started writing The End of Men 2 days after I finished that first manuscript.
Wow.
First draft took me 9 months. It was a lot quicker. I remember feeling like, on the one hand, I cannot believe I need to write a novel again, which is a feeling I now have every time I sit down to write. It's like, oh, you have to keep doing this. But also, I had done it before. Like, I knew I could finish writing a full manuscript, and that felt like a key that I'd turned into a lot. I finished the first draft after 9 months in June 2019. Went through the querying process, was very fortunate. The querying process went very quickly for me. And I started with my agent, Felicity Blunt at Curtis Brown, who is Marvel. And she basically said, I love the book, change everything about it. And I was like, what? And we went through a very big rewrite process, which was very helpful. And completely transformed the book. And that was about 3 months. I wrote about 100,000 words in 3 months. And was very tough at the end of that. And then, the book sold in January 2020. And that's a kind of whistle stop tour through how I got into writing got here.
Wow. That is an impressive story.
It is. Just rewinding very slightly back before we hear about the book. You mentioned that you were writing it when you were younger and you were attempting to write intros and these sort of things, or just this first, half of the book, whatever that may be. What was the inspiration for that exactly? Was there something you loved to read as a young person, or was there some sort of inspiration elsewhere?
That's a really good question. I think I've probably got 7 or 8 beginnings of novels on like various laptops, Google Drives, and generally they were what I read. So I read a huge amount of YA, and like definitely tried to write that when I was a teenager, and actually am writing a YA novel at the moment. I think YA is not just for young adults, and I actually wrote quite a lot of historical romance, which is because I love reading historical romance. I'm a long-time Bridgerton fan, long before the show, and probably not a huge surprise, speculative fiction. Like I always had ideas of kind of, a what if question that you would apply. I read a lot of speculative fiction, I read a lot of fantasy. So it might seem like a very broad spectrum, but I think I was always trying these different things to kind of see what would stick. And I do say to people actually that if you like lots of different genres and you have different ideas, but you just feel like you want to finish a novel, that genre fiction is on the one hand, I think very, very, very difficult to write, like romance novels, crime novels, thrillers. And the reader knows you're going to end up at B to get there in a way that's tense and interesting. But it also kind of gives you a format that you have to stick within. And I found that really helpful. So the novel that I finished before End of Men was a historical romance novel. You could not have a bigger plot twist than going from historical romance to the End of Men. But that's what I did. And it was really, really helpful, I think, having a kind of structure that I understood really well. Yeah. What I read basically is what kind of led into what I was writing.
Amazing.
So, Christina, you said obviously you had the idea for the End of Men, and you thought, yeah, that is the one. What made you decide? Because I know a lot of authors have that idea that yeah, this is the one, but I'm not quite ready for it yet. What made you think, right, I've done the first one, now I'm ready to tackle the End of Men, and I know what I want to do with it?
So it was partly that I'm a very impatient person. So I forced myself to finish that first book, because I knew that otherwise I would so easily jump between books forever. So it was having forced myself basically to finish the first one, and that took about 6 months from having the idea. I was just raring to go. I just wanted to get started with it, and the impatience meant that I didn't want to take a week or a month. I just was like, right, let's get going. So it was partly that with 6 months of kind of thinking about the ideas and like jotting down notes, I felt really ready to kind of sit down and get started.
So I feel like we could definitely go into that now, but I'd prefer it if you told the viewers watching a little bit about the End of Men before we start going into the ins and outs of like how the process went and all that sort of stuff. Because I've got a million questions, but I realise people probably want to know what the book's about before we go into them.
Sure. So The End of Men is a piece of speculative fiction set between 2025 and 2031, and it explores what the world would look like without men. So in it, there is a virus to which women are immune that quickly wipes out 90% of the world's men. So it's told in a multi-character style, in first-person kind of narration. So you follow different characters, people like Amanda, who's the A&E doctor who treats patient zero, Catherine, who's a mother with a young son and husband in London who's trying to keep safe, Toby, who's stuck on a ship outside Iceland and he can't go back to shore because if he does, he'll probably catch the virus and die. And Lisa, who is a virologist trying to find a cure. And between those characters and a number of others, you see in the short term kind of, are they going to be okay? Are their families going to be okay? And how is the world changing in this quite scary way? And then in the longer term, how society would have to adapt and how people emotionally would have to adapt, and kind of looking at how different countries would respond differently to a big gender imbalance.
So obviously that's great depiction of it there for anyone who doesn't know what it's about. But obviously you've talked about the sheer volume and the size of it in terms of you've got multiple characters and you're narrating all of their different experiences. Like for a lot of authors maybe watching, that'd be quite an intimidating thing to try and take on. So obviously the way that you've kind of done it is by sectioning it into different you've got like remembrance and stuff like that, different chapter title. Well, I say chapters, but sections of the book. Was that always something that you had in mind, or did that come out through the editing process?
Yeah, so it was always multi-character, but actually in the first draft, I wrote it so that each character only appeared once. So there was actually about 40 or 40 odd characters in the first book. I say the first book, like the first draft that got me signed with my agent. So in that way, it somehow made it a bit less intimidating, because I just had to like, it was like literally like focusing on like 2,000 words at a time. It felt a bit like I was writing like that, kind of like a combination of short stories telling this overarching narrative. So that was good from a world building perspective, because I dealt with kind of every country and possible facet you can imagine. But it meant that the book wasn't as emotionally engaging, because you really want to follow people's experiences. So with my agent, what she very rightly said was, I think we want to like winnow this down and focus on these key characters. You still tell the story and you have this richly drawn world, but we really feel how this world kind of looks for people. So I think actually that I think I would have found it more intimidating if I needed to kind of figure out which key characters to follow, and balancing telling the world and who, you know, which one would be told when. So in some ways, I kind of avoided that issue by having each perspective only once. And then it was with hopefully the guidance of an agent and kind of working with someone in that editing process that we got it down to a slightly more sensible kind of core of characters.
I'm very interested, sorry, Chris, jumping in there, about when you spoke about when you got an agent and you spoke about an editor, and that you cut a lot of the story, or not cut so much, but changed a lot of the story. At the time, how far off did you think your story was kind of ready, and how surprised were you at the changes that were coming, and how did you deal with those?
I missed the end of that, but I think you were saying kind of how close to perfect did I think it was, and how did I feel about the editing? I was kind of aware that I'm not a brilliant editor, so I'm very good, I'd like to think, at turning other people's comments. And once I kind of have a direction, I'm good at following it. But I'm very bad at just identifying in my own work or other people's what's wrong with it. I'm absolutely not advertising my services as beta reader. I've tried. I'm so bad. So I kind of hit a wall, you know, I queried it on the basis that I was like, this is as good as I can get it. But, you know, it's a bit like a blind spot. I was like, I don't really know what to do next. And I'm a lawyer, and in law, you know, you go through this process of big documents like witness statements and, you know, kind of contracts and stuff where you go through drafts and drafts and drafts and drafts. So I'm used to that concept of this is as good as I can get something, and then you hand it over to the people who kind of know more than you, and they then work through it. And, you know, in the end, the finished piece of work is this kind of shining, perfect thing because of lots of people's perspectives. And I kind of applied that thinking. I was like, you know, Felicity knows a huge amount. We immediately had the same like idea in terms of I completely agreed with the direction she wanted to take it. But I trusted her. And you just have to trust the agent, and you could feel that, I think, as soon as you meet with them. Like, do you and I kind of get on? Do our brains work in the same way? But I knew that I'd made it as good as I could make it. But immediately it made sense. It's like, yeah, let's make this book as emotionally engaging and gripping as we can, and also let's do the work. There's lots of it.
So, Christina, one of the books that it reminded, well, two books actually, it reminded me quite a bit of. One of, they're both written by the same guy. So, Stephen King, it reminded me of The Stand in part, because obviously you've got I know yours is first person and his is third person, but you still follow different characters and you get emotionally invested in their stories as the story goes on. But it also reminded me of Carrie in the way that you use newspaper reports and snippets of stuff like that, you know, bits of people's conversations and diaries and journal entries and stuff like that. So I suppose my question is, what sort of things influenced you when you sat down to write this book, or was this something that you didn't really research? You just kind of had this idea and went with it?
So I was definitely inspired hugely by some books. I'd read World War Z when I was 20 or 22, and I love that book. It's still one of my favorite books. I didn't read a huge amount of sci-fi at the time, and I remember reading it and going, like, I just couldn't put it down. It was the most terrifying thing in the world. And I think one thing I love about that book is that it's talking about a zombie war. It's, you know, it requires a real suspension of disbelief, and yet to me it feels like the most realistic, you know, showing of this completely unbelievable thing. And you can really see, I think, the impact of the kind of UN report multi-character style of that book definitely inspired the narration of The End of Men. And I read The Power in early 2018, and it completely opened my mind to this idea of using speculative fiction as a way to explore gender. And I kind of feel like the book, if I had to kind of comp the book, I would probably say it was World War Z meets The Power. So that had a big impact. And then I also read Station 11 when I was rewriting it. My agent said, when I met with her, she said, have you read Station 11? I said, no. She went, you should read it. And it was really helpful, actually, because I already had the story. So I wasn't too influenced by, you know, this alternative pandemic book. But I think Station 11 is a really emotionally engaging pandemic story that in many ways is about so much more than just a pandemic. And that I think was a very helpful kind of North Star as I was writing Out of Men. So those were three really big inspirations for the story.
So when you say with your agent and your editor, you sat down, you whittled 40 characters down to the characters that we've got in the book. How did people like Catherine and Amanda and Lisa in particular, how did they manage to survive the cut when, 30 odd others disappeared? So
Catherine, interestingly, wasn't in the first draft. She is an invention of the rewrite. And so Catherine is kind of, I think, the heart of the story. So in the first draft, there was this kind of unseen narrator, and that didn't really work. So we made it feel, I think, more like kind of a classic novel in that, there were just characters and you follow them. So Catherine was an invention, and in that sense, she kind of, there was a void, I think, where something like her was needed. Whereas I think for Amanda and Lisa, the real question was who is essential to the story? The doctor who first treats patient zero, someone trying to find a vaccine. There's another character called Dawn, who's a civil servant who's really trying to literally keep the country's lights on as everything seems to be falling apart. Like her superiors keep dying. She keeps getting promoted very quickly. So it was really like how, crucial are you to the story, and also how strong was the character voice. So Lisa, for example, is this quite distinct, I think it's safe to say, character. She's got very clear purpose, what she wants. And so her felt like one, it was really, really exciting to lean into. So that, a combination of necessity and, clarity of voice, I think, was how we really decided.
It's really interesting when you mentioned World War Z as well, because when you're speaking about the different sort of roles your characters had, it kind of reminded me of that at the time, and it's something I absolutely love as well. It's a fantastic world building a book with so many great ideas, and your ship person reminded me of the astronauts stuck in space watching things unfold. So it is something that is fantastic in comparison, but in reality, whilst you were writing this, little did you know that soon enough there would be a real pandemic emerging in our world that is still ongoing now. So when this started becoming apparent, whilst were you still in the writing process at the time?
No, and thank God, because I don't know what we would have done. I finished writing in the rewrite in December 2019, and the book sold in January 2020. And I have an email from my agent sending me one of the first articles about coronavirus, just as the book was going on submission, going, this is weird. And you know, there's so, you don't have hindsight, right, at the time. So the book sold, and then kind of a month later, it felt like everything just changed. So it was very, very odd timing, but it was very odd timing.
Have you ever thought that the next time you release a book that might happen as well? So write something nice? I don't know.
In my mind, I've had a kind of Cassandra, like, existential crisis moment of, one of my friends was like, just write a utopia this time.
Yeah.
Keep in mind.
That's crazy, isn't it? I mean, it must have really affected your thought of how this book might sell at the time. Did you feel like it would have put people off or dragged people into that story? How did you feel as an author releasing that when that happened?
This is why I'm so relieved the book went on submission before, because I think having your book go out on submission to editors is already just the most stressful thing. It's obviously a really odd thing to have a book about a pandemic coming, out in a pandemic. I think it will be a bit of both. Inevitably, there are some people that are really interested in pandemics now. Maybe some people won't be. But I think for me, the key thing about the book is really, the central question: what would the world look like without men? And that gender aspect of it, really means that it's not, quote unquote, just a book about a pandemic. And I think interest in that topic will survive, the fact that it's a pandemic book. And I'm very, very, very relieved for so many reasons that bookshops are open. I really feel for anyone who's been releasing a book into like lockdowns. So it does feel also, I'm very, very grateful that it's out now and not, 6 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the pandemic thing is much of an issue. This is actually the second pandemic book that I've read this year. And I've actually really enjoyed both of them. Like, despite my world being similar in some aspects at the time. But obviously, like you said, your central question is completely as far away from the pandemic. If anything, I mean, this is going to sound quite bad, but I actually felt better about our situation that it wasn't this, because that would have been a lot worse.
I think that's actually a real thing. I was thinking about this because Bryony Gordon, said that the book made her feel a bit better about the world we're living in. And that was such a nice thing that was such a kind of unexpected, obviously, element of a review to have. And I thought about why, and I think it's partly that in a book you get resolution. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. And this story is told in a complete way. Whereas the world we're living in at the moment, well, obviously, there's light at the end of the tunnel, we're getting there, but we don't have resolution in the real world. You don't get a nice the end, and that's ta-da. So I actually think I think there's something quite comforting about there's this world and it's different and there's some parallels, but you get to reach the end and close it and feel like there's some resolution.
Sorry, Chris, I was going to say, with your actual characters then and the focus on them a little bit, what made you, because obviously they're all very different and they're all focusing on different themes as well. So I'm thinking particularly about Lisa, obviously without going into it in too much detail, but what made you want to write a character of that nature and do the things that she does? And then with Amanda and Catherine, what made you want to explore those different avenues? So obviously I'll leave it up to you to how much you divulge.
So Lisa is one of the kind of clearest character voices I've ever had. Sometimes people say this character just wrote themselves. And she really was one of those where, so she is trying to find a vaccine, and she is not what you would think of, I suppose, as this typical person who's like very compassionate and trying to do good things for the world. She's like, I'm really clever and I want to be recognized. Much her worldview. And so she just had this real clarity, and she just wrote every kind of outrageous thing she does actually is very sane. Like, she's very, very rational. She's not, bouncing off the walls. She's just very, very clear and doesn't really care if people or kind of conventions say that she should do X, Y, Z. So that was just really fun to write. And then Amanda is this very wry, no nonsense, quite funny Glaswegian doctor. I grew up in Glasgow. We moved up when I was a teenager, which is why I don't sound like I'm from Glasgow. But I grew up around lots of my friends' parents, for example, were doctors, and there was lots of, these very no nonsense practical Glaswegians working in hospitals. And so that felt, that obviously you can't just write what you know, because if you did, every book would be quite boring. But I think it's helpful to have strands of things, and I definitely feel very comfortable writing, that felt like a nice place to ground the story, especially for something as fantastical as this virus that only kills men. And Amanda's probably the closest to my internal voice, if that makes sense. And then Catherine, I say she was kind of the heart of the story. And it was really fun writing her afresh when I was doing this rewrite, because every other character already existed. So it was like, well, what is it? Catherine really answers the question, what would it feel like to be in this world where she has a husband, she has a young son, her parents are dead. She's like, these people are my world and they are in danger. How does that feel? And you get to see and feel from her perspective what it would be like. So I suppose that they're all, there's different elements to all of them, but it felt like to me that they each complement the story in different ways.
I'm really interested in, if we just sort of go back to the start of your publishing sort of success story, I guess. Did you ever expect to be published? And I know you talked about how your first few attempts, that you kind of knew that they weren't really in the pipeline for that. But when you wrote a book that you kind of felt that this is good enough, how did you pursue that avenue of chasing a publisher, and what was that process like for you?
So I did always have complete belief that I'd be published, but obviously with dark moments of doubt. But I think you do. I think you have to completely believe it, otherwise you can't do it. I mean, I was writing properly in a committed way for actually in many ways it was not that long before I had an agent, but it felt it was nearly 3 years. It felt like quite a long time, and I remember somebody being like, "Am I wasting hundreds of hours of my mid-20s? I already have a very busy job. I'm writing at night and at weekends. Like, am I wasting my time?" So inevitably you have moments of that, but I think you have to treat it, and I did this, I treated it like a job. And I say to people, you just have to treat it like a job long before anyone's paying you. So I was very committed to it, and I was like, I'm just going to keep going. I remember reading that Jojo Moyes, I think it was her 4th manuscript. I can't remember if it got her an agent or got her published. But I thought, if someone as amazing as Jojo Moyes, it wasn't her first manuscript, I'm going to give myself a few shots at this.
Definitely.
But I was very confident. I was like, it's going to happen. Quietly confident. I didn't talk about it with anyone, but I thought in my head, right, this is going to pay off in the end. And then, once you have the book, the relief of, okay, I'm going to try and, get this somewhere, but at least I finished the book now. For me, at least, felt enormous. And I was quite organized, and I do recommend this actually with querying. I think you should query a lot of people. There's so many things that go into someone representing you. They have to love, not just like, they have to love the book. They have to have space on their list. They have to think it's commercial, whatever that means. They have to not represent something too similar, probably. There's a lot of magic that goes into that. So I queried 20 people. I made a spreadsheet, and I basically listed every agency in the UK and chose my favorite agent, split that into two, plan A and plan B. I sound so dorky when I talk about this, but that's how I did it. And so I queried the 20 agents on plan A, and had all of them said no, I would have paid a professional editing service to give me an editorial letter, rewritten the book, and then queried the agents in plan B. Happily didn't have to do that. But even then, I got 4 offers, which is wonderful, and I was thrilled. And Christy was my first choice agent. But that also means that, for a book that has sold 16 agents for very sensible reasons, that could be anything from I'm too busy to this just isn't my jam, said no. So I always do say to people, you've done the hard work. You've done the hard work and finished the book. Send it to lots of people. Yeah.
It really isn't dorky at all. And I mean, it's something that a lot of people who are in the writing process now, maybe they've written the 3rd or 4th book, or they've on their very first manuscript, they have no idea of that process. And the fact you've highlighted, making a spreadsheet, making that sort of commitment to say, if this doesn't get to them, I'm rewriting with some help. That is a really great insight. And I think people really appreciate that. So definitely don't think that's dorky. It's very valuable information.
And one thing I'm going to say as well is that I've done some writing tips on my Instagram. And one thing I shared, they're on highlights on my Instagram. One thing I shared was actually the content of the query letter that I sent out. And I was surprised actually by the people who said, oh, thank you. People often talk about this, but don't actually share like what was in their query letter. You should personalize it, I think, for sure, and kind of say, I'm querying you because of this person you represent, or you said you like this. So obviously it's just for them, but to the extent that's helpful, I think it's always quite comforting to see someone else's example.
Yeah, so Christina, if we go back to the end of Men for a little bit, obviously there's some really big questions that you posed, especially towards the end of the book. What was the motivation behind exploring these? And obviously, again, I don't want to reveal anything unless you don't want anything to, but you can divulge as much as you want. So why did you want to look at these certain questions? Yeah, that's the question basically.
Well, so it's such a big question, isn't it? Like, what would the world look like without men? And the book is now. I don't think it's not dystopian or utopian. It's not like a reverse Handmaid's Tale. Women aren't hunting men, and it's not that I'm like, oh, the world would be so much better. I would hope that it is a truly hyper realistic representation of what would happen, which is there would be a huge amount of loss. Almost every person on Earth would have lost something close to them, but also that practically. I wanted to explore, what does Parliament look like? If not just it's suddenly equal, but if suddenly, 90% of men aren't there anymore, how does a hospital function? What things actually could change? For example, the things in the world that are designed currently for the default, which is neutral, which is actually kind of the default for men. And it was just really interesting to me to have that thought experiment of what would change, how would it change, what would the world look like in this very different way? For example, there's a scene where one of the characters is meeting up with her friend, and she's in the city, and they go for a drink. And I work in the city, and obviously it's normally a mix of men in suits and and women. And I was even thinking about what it would look like to suddenly have you'd be walking down a street in the city of London, and it would be like, actually, there's maybe one man for every 9 women. Like, what does that look like? So everything from what it looked like to what the world would sound like to the culture people would be experiencing, like what books would be popular, like what would we all want to listen to and watch and read that would help us process. Like, it was a really fun thing to imagine. Obviously, as I say, there is quite a lot of, I think, kind of grief and loss and ultimately hope in the book. But as someone who wanted to kind of have that thought experiment, I was kind of like, what would change, and the sky's the limit.
So as someone obviously who's taken the time to build such a huge world, essentially, fictional world, would you ever be tempted to dip back into it to see different characters' perspectives, possibly in the future, or to see what it looks like, so many years on, in the aftermath? Is that something that you plan to do, maybe?
I don't plan to, but I think I would potentially like to. It's one of those things where the idea of doing it now would be quite I'm too close to it still. But I think it would be really interesting to explore maybe 20 years down the line. what does that look like? Because obviously the book, actually 6 years is quite a long time for a book, but it's still not a huge expanse of time. Even at the end of the book, people are still at the beginning of adaptation and recovery. So I think it would be potentially something that could be really interesting. Like what's, for example, at the point where every child who has been born in 2030, is now an adult, what on earth is it like to have grown up in a world recovering from that plague where 90% of the world's population is female? I think that could be really interesting. Oops, sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I was muted myself. Classically, I said it's definitely interesting to see the angles you could take with that and where that could go. It could go anyway, really. And with that in mind, you mentioned how you've written various things previously or sort of leading up to your release. So, is there a genre that you haven't worked in that you really kind of want to focus on or want to move to, or would you stick with what you're doing now?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to say both, in that I love speculative fiction. I think it's kind of my fictional home. So, and I've just written my second novel. I've just written my second draft of that. So, and that's also speculative. And I think I want to keep writing things in the kind of speculative vein. But I would also really love to write a fantasy novel, whilst they are in some ways maybe different in different places in, a bookshop. I think they're kind of two sides of quite a similar coin. So yes, I would love to write fantasy at some point.
Brilliant. What we're going to do very quickly before we move on to get some questions in from the community, we'll ask you a few staple questions from the Writing Community Chat show, and then we'll introduce someone on the show, not on the show, but from the follows us on Twitter, just to give them a bit of an uplift from the community. So we'll just get some questions in, Chris.
Yeah, so the first of the staple questions is, if you could take any character from fiction and make them your own, and we say have a crack, but that sometimes goes down the wrong way. But basically make that character your own and have your own sort of go with that character, make your own story, either put them into one of your stories or create something completely new and original. Which character from fiction would that be and why?
Oh, what a question. I'm going to choose Kate Sheffield from The Viscount Who Loved Me, which is the second Bridgerton novel, because it's a novel that inspired me to become a novelist. And she is, in many ways, I think what I try and make sure that my female character is as good as she is. She's wry, funny, no nonsense, but very well drawn. And I would love to have her in either a fantasy novel or kind of bring her into the present day in a speculative novel and have her as a central character.
That is a fantastically quick answer. We normally get a lot of funny faces after that one, but well done. That's a great answer. Okay, so the next part of that question is, if you could change the ending to anything, and we always open this up to TV, film, or any sort of literature. You change the ending to anything, what would you change and why?
Game of Thrones TV show.
What, sorry?
The Game of Thrones.
Oh, well, yeah.
So that's probably quite a cliched answer. That didn't take me long. I would change that. I mean, I'm so curious to see what George R. R. Martin actually does with the books, which seem he hasn't committed to it one way or another. So who knows what that's going to be? But I just kind of was one of those people watching it, going, "What? No, no." I would not have John kill Daenerys. I feel like it's okay to say that without spoilers now.
I was going to shout spoilers, but I thought, do you know what? No, there's no.
If you're not seeing it, you're probably not going to watch it. So, another staple question that we have is, you're on your. It's a bit morbid, so I have to apologise. But you're on your deathbed and you're looking back at your writing career. What does success look like to you? What would you be happy with?
Oh, I think for me, it would be having written all of the key ideas that I really desperately wanted to write. And so for me, like one of those End of Men, I knew that that was just not going to leave my brain until I'd written it. I recently read YA contemporary that again had been like rattling around my brain for years. That I think is a big thing for me. I want to have written a fantasy novel. I have a few speculative ideas I want to write. And I feel like a good idea, also sign of it, is if it just won't go. It just sticks around in your brain. So for me, that'd be a big thing, to have actually kind of written the ideas I really wanted to write.
So just on that, sorry, do you know when you signed your book deal, obviously for The End of Men, obviously, again, you can divulge as much as you want, but was that a multiple book deal? And did they say, The End of Men is like this, but we don't mind the next book being very different, because obviously we don't necessarily want it to be exactly the same? Or what was the process there with that?
I don't think I'm probably allowed to say that much, both about like the next book or the process. But what I will say is that I suppose for me, this is actually something I feel quite strongly about, in that like I'm a really loyal reader to authors. I know, because like everyone has different ways of how they find books, but once I find an author I like, I'm very, very loyal. As you can see, the stack of Marion Keys behind me, that's a like Cecilia Ahern section. Harry Potter. So for me, I think it's really important that someone who read The End of Men would go, yes, that next book looks like the kind of thing that I'll enjoy. You don't want it to be derivative, it needs to still be original. But I think that's something for me I feel quite strongly about, is that there feels like consistency. So that's not really even a discussion as much as something that I felt quite strongly about.
Yeah,
it's fantastically organised bookshelf, by the way.
It's my pride and joy. So
just going back to what you recently said when you mentioned about the different stories, and that's kind of your goal to get all these ideas out. But you also mentioned that when you were younger, you wrote a lot of beginnings of stories. Are they still around? Are they ever going to blossom? Is there an idea that could work?
That's such a good question, and the answer I think is no. And like, I have gone back over some of them, and often and it's actually something I think often happens, is that it's a lot easier, I think, to write a character than a plot. You know, the really hard thing is actually a plot that you can sustain over 80,000 words. And so when I look back at them, there are kind of shades of things that could work, but none of them really have a hook. There's no like, okay, well, this is my plot in 3 sentences. But I think maybe some of the characters or the ideas in them would move forward. But yeah, there are no amazing plots stuck in my decade-old Google Drive I can use.
That's a shame. It's a shame. You never know. One day you might have a different opinion on that. You never know.
And we have been throwing this question in recently, so we might as well ask it. It has become a bit of a staple question, but if you could collaborate with any author that has died, which author would that be? But bear in mind, the condition that you get to collaborate with them is that you then have to kill them. So which author would it be, and how would you kill them? I love that shot.
So to be clear, I'm bringing someone back from the dead, and I get to write a book with them, but then they have to go back to being dead.
Yeah, and you have to be the one that sends them there.
Jane Austen, she'd forgive me. I believe she'd forgive me, but I mean, Austen. That's the Jane Austen collection off my head. So, yeah, kill me to kill her, but what a woman.
How would you kill Jane Austen then? Obviously, you brought her back. You wrote a great book together.
I mean, poison is that kindest. Give her.
Well, I don't know about that.
Well, I don't
that's definitely Game of Thronesy.
Painless. Do that.
You know, well done on completing the book. We're going to release it tomorrow. Let's celebrate with some wine. I don't know.
That's a great idea. I love it.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good one. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a new family member. I hope you like rock music. Otherwise, this is weird for you. But we'll do a little intro video and we'll get a family member announced. And then we'll ask you some more questions from the community. And there is the wonderful video. So that person today, this person, Chris, is called Edith Hotier, maybe, and her Twitter is at EDYREM1. I'm not sure what that says, but that's her Twitter name. And her bio says, just me, progressing every day, writing and pretty much enjoying life as it comes. So that's a great bio. And what we do now... Yes, that's the lady. What we do, Christina, is send this person a GIF, so an animated thing on Twitter. What theme of GIF should we send this lady so everyone watching and listening can send that person and give them a welcome to the family?
I think something magical, whether that's Harry Potter, sparkles, stars, witches.
Love it. Oh. Some magical tweets, please, to at EDYREM1. If you're listening back on a podcast like a week later, don't worry about it. Just send it in and just say welcome to the family, or that's the one.
Yeah,
brilliant.
I just wanted to, if you don't tag in the show and you don't tag in new family member, it does get a bit weird. So just do that maybe as well.
Try not just to post random things on their feed without explanations. I think that would be good. But welcome to the family anyways, if you listen to this, and we'll support you as the community does. Fantastic. So whilst they're doing that, Christina, is there an author that you absolutely love that you recommend people should read?
Yes, V.E. Schwab is one, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing her surname. I'm one of the many people who's recently read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which is just a lesson in how to write a perfectly plotted novel. It is historical and it's got a magical element to it. For anyone who doesn't know, Addie basically makes a deal with essentially the devil when she's 17, and so she will always be forgotten, but she becomes immortal.
Wow.
And so it's about remembrance, and it's about what it means to kind of be human. And it also shows you everything from, Paris in the 1600s to Berlin in the 1800s. She's in all these different places. So you get this span of the world, but all through the engagement and kind of emotional relationship you have with this one central character. It is divine. So be sure is my recommendation.
So when you say she's immortal, does she stay 17 forever?
Yes, she's named.
Wow.
It does. That sounds a fantastic concept. I like the sound of that. Fantastic. So let's have a couple of questions from the community. Guys, if you're watching this right now live, whether you joined us just now or you've been watching for a while, send some questions in the chat right now and we will pop them on screen if they're applicable. And for Christina, for Chris Hooley, for myself, or for all of us as a group, whatever you want to ask within reason, please send them in right now and we will ask them. So the first question we have is from Anders. Hello to you. What was the most difficult aspect of writing this particular book?
That's a really good question. The most difficult part of writing the first draft was, frankly, not getting lost in it, because it had this quite big time span of several years. It was trying to make sure that that made sense and that you could kind of accurately track how time was moving so that the reader didn't go, hang on, wait, what? When is it? Where are we? What's happening? And then in terms of the rewrite, it was making it as emotional as possible. And I always say that with speculative fiction, you want to see what the world looks like and what it feels like. And so trying to really show, not tell, what this world looks like through people's emotional reactions and their perspectives, that was rewarding but very difficult.
That's a fantastic answer.
Yeah, and can I just elaborate on that a little tiny bit? How did you find writing some of those emotional scenes? Because as you said, obviously there's quite a few in there. Were there any in particular that were really difficult to write or that you did draw on other experiences for example?
For sure, there's some. So especially I think with Catherine, because she's in London, she somehow just felt a bit, I don't know, it felt closer to my life. I just so desperately wanted everything to be okay for her, and I don't spoil anything. But writing any scene, inevitably within the book, 90% of the world's men die, so you kind of know that not every male character is going to survive. And writing scenes was just heartbreaking. And I think it's a good sign as a writer if you're really feeling, this tug as bad things are happening to people. Yes, it was very emotional, but also had to be done.
Brilliant. Okay, from Jodie, hello. What was one cheat for going from a novice to a great writer? And that's a question all of us want to know.
I actually think that so my agent says this a lot when we're working on editing. She says, there have to be stakes. What are the stakes? And it's something I really think about. It's so easy with speculative fiction, and actually always, to just tell a story, but you kind of know where the story's going. Whereas you want it to feel propulsive. And I think about that now a lot. Every single page, why am I turning the page? So it should never feel, I don't think, really slow. And if you can't really justify why a scene or a page is happening, you need to be brutal and either rewrite it or cut it. So I think that's the thing. If you think about the books that become, really big bestsellers, books like Addie LaRue, for example, you just can't, I think you can't put them down, right? And so every single page, every scene, what are the stakes here? Why do I want to find out what happens next? I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, when I was reading The End of Men, I got to like one person's section and that ended, and I was like, just another page. So, and then obviously that carried on and on and on, and I think I read it in 2 sittings. One simply because I was tired, otherwise I would have read it in one. But how did you actively like look at how you were finishing each person's section? To just sort of leave it, not like on little mini cliffhangers, I suppose, in terms of, I do want to see how that's going to plan out for that book character.
Yes, I did, and I still do it. I've been doing it with my next book, and it's something I've realised as well that I read quite a lot of fantasy. It's very commonly done. I've been reading the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas, which is a young adult series. It's very popular, especially on TikTok, but it's great. And she's so good at perfectly pacing it. So you're like, no, I need to know what happens next. Okay, fine. And I think it's, it's a really good way to make sure that in fact, that's how I judge how to end a section, how to end a chapter, is what are we just about? There's about to be a resolution, but you're holding it just out of reach, and then it makes it more satisfying in the next section.
Brilliant. It is good. Okay. Ross Young says hello. He doesn't say, I say hello. Are there any tropes that you can't stand in a specific fiction?
Oh, that's
speculative fiction. Yeah, again.
It's not a trope so much as I think that the big thing that I need to have in speculative fiction is to have world building that is like it unfurls slowly.
Sorry, I made Chris lose the plot.
Yeah, I did. Sorry.
I'm being my classic self and getting things wrong. I apologize. You should know me by now.
Yeah, I can't bear it when there's, and to be clear, you don't really read this because it's the kind of thing that gets edited out. But you have someone who's clearly trying to build an entire world. I'm going to give you another minute. World building should be slow and gradual, not here's my world and it's being done in 50 pages because you can't do it. So you need to keep finding things out about the world all the way through the book. I think it's the big thing that's important. And actually, Handmaid's Tale is a really good example of that. So I've kind of flipped that. A trope that I do like is gradual world building.
And you mentioned a comment before about showing the reader and not telling the reader. Now, that's something that when I teach, and that's something that I tell my students all the time, and they look at me and they go, well, how do we do that? And I think a lot of writers do struggle with that. So how do you do that?
So I try and stick to see how I think about someone entering into a scene. So for example, I was actually thinking about this recently where I had a character where I felt like I was just kind of telling their backstory. And so I changed it so that one character, he comes home and it's not really his house, it's his sister's house. And so immediately I was like, okay, I've shown that he's really close to his sister because he just turns up at her house at the end of the day, right? Doesn't have to arrange to turn up. And he has more money than she does. And instead of telling you that, I was like, right, he bought a really nice armchair. And he lies to her and he's like, yeah, I found it. It's secondhand, don't worry about it. And she's like, okay. She knows he bought it for her. That kind of shows you their dynamic. So he walks in, his niece is curled up in the armchair. You find out a bit about the armchair. And so in kind of 2 paragraphs, you find out he's close to his sister, he's close to his niece, he's got more money than his sister does. She's kind of proud, but not so proud that she won't accept the armchair. And he made sure to buy the exact one she'd want, not the one that he'd want, and gave it to her. And so that is, instead of having lots of exposition, you see this character moving through his world and you find out things that way. So I kind of quite consciously, when I feel myself explaining, and this is what happened, this is how he feels about X, trying to really show that through little anecdotes, little bits of domestic life, especially.
Brilliant. That's a much better answer. Now I normally go, yeah.
It's so much easier said than done. It's something that is really difficult.
It's a really good answer. Thank you for that. And I apologize for being a bit distracted there. Right. So is there anything that was changed from early drafts that you wish you could have had kept in the book, which is a great question?
That is a really good question. And I can happily genuinely say no. And part of the reason I can say no is because it was a really elongated process. And we kind of did very carefully think, and I say elongated because a lot of the stuff that disappeared in that first rewrite didn't need to be there. But then we very carefully, when I say we, so when it was my editor and I, once the book had been sold, when we were going through figuring out these final perspectives, like, is this worth keeping it? Is it not? We did actually give it a lot of thought. And so there was one perspective in New Zealand with basically the idea that you would try and kind of quarantine basically pregnant women to see if you could, have babies in quarantine to make sure that they didn't catch it. You would save hopefully as many, small children as you could. That we kind of went back and forth and ultimately was like, no, this sticks in people's minds. We really want this to be in the book. So happily no, because a lot of thought went into making sure that everything we wanted to stay did.
Brilliant. That's great.
And just on that, obviously you said no, but you said as well you wrote loads of characters. So is there a character that you may revisit or bring into a different scenario? Because obviously, you've created these characters first time round. It's not like you couldn't put some of them, because obviously it is speculative fiction, but it is very much set in the real world. So you could perhaps use them again in another story. Is that something that you could do in the future?
There is one that is in the book, but it's not her perspective, if that makes sense. She's called Bryony, and she sets up a dating app. And she works a dating app when the plague happens, and she sets up a dating app basically that's designed around a world where 90% of people died and there's this huge imbalance. And she's interviewed by a journalist, and that's how her story is told. but originally had a section from Bryony's perspective, and I think she was quite an interesting character, quite mercurial, but also actually, she was like, look, this is a nightmare, and I'm trying to do my best. She's doing what she thinks is the best she can do in extraordinary circumstances, and I wouldn't mind revisiting her. I would maybe write a short story from that perspective potentially. I think that could be interesting.
Yeah, that was almost like a sort of Mr. Robot element in terms of she took like different people from the company, didn't she, to make that app? Yeah, that was definitely just you saying it now. I could see that being a whole, not even just a short story, maybe a whole avenue of stories.
If this book became optioned and there was lined up for a series or film, are there anyone in your mind as an actor that could play a couple of your characters? Would you have anyone in your?
So when I was writing it, I had Romola Garai in mind as Catherine, and she's just like kind of, that's how I think Catherine looks. And then one of my friends suggested Emma Thompson as Lisa Michael, and I now cannot unsee. Once it clicked, oh my god!
Yeah, definitely, I could see Emma Thompson doing that.
And Kelly MacDonald, who is a really fab Scottish actress, as Amanda MacLean. Those were a few that they feel quite nice in my mind.
Fantastic. Question from Linda: are you a pantster or plotter?
I would so love to be a plotter. I cannot even tell you. I want with every piece of my soul to be a plotter, and I'm not. I'm unfortunately a pantser. I have to figure out what the book is going to be by writing the book. And I have tried writing with a plan. Like I tried writing this YA contemporary novel with a plan. And then the plan was wrong. And I finished the book and it was like, well, that's actually kind of boring, those elements. And I've had to rewrite it, once, and I need to do another draft, to be honest. So I think it does depend on who you are as a writer. As I say, I would love to be a plotter, and some people write these amazing books with a really key plan and then it works. But for me, for whatever reason, I basically have to write each book 3 times, pretty much. I forgive myself for not being a planner. I'm just leading into the chaos.
I was surprised by that answer, only because of your organized bookshelf. That I'm also a pantser, and I kind of do the same thing. So do you, like myself, you write a first draft quite quickly and perhaps a skeleton style draft, and then you kind of pad out the story, and then you really put the finer details on the third draft?
Alas, no, it's less efficient than that. I can't write in a skeleton way. I kind of have to write in a finalized way. I can only kind of write one way. And I always think that this is going to be it. Like I have such belief and hope that this time the first draft's going to be the one, and then not. So no, it's just I write it, and then basically between me and my agent we go, okay, this is what's working, but also that's actually really showing us the other direction we need to go in. So off we go and change it in that way, and then we kind of rip it apart and put it back together again.
Wow, that's amazing. Excellent.
So, obviously, before we come to the end, Christina, this is a beautiful copy of The End of Men. Can you?
Oh, that's the.
Oh, that is a fantastic. Oh, what are the quotes on the front?
That is Paula Hawkins, a fiercely intelligent page turner.
Wow.
Thrilled by.
Amazing, love that. So when people watching and listening, when can they get hold of a copy?
So if you are in the US and Canada, you can buy it on the 27th of April, and if you're in the UK, you can buy it on the 29th of April.
Amazing. Is there a website they can go to? Is it specifically anywhere? Is there a personal website or Waterstones? Where can I get it?
Yeah, so you can get it at Waterstones, Amazon, bookshop.org, and there are also signed copies available from Goldsboro if you're in the UK, and you get a free, very snazzy tote with this kind of red and black design on it. So those are the main places I think you can get it from.
That's amazing. I got a random question for you. If magic is real, and what magic spell would you, if you could have one, what would you have as a spell that you could use? As a what?
Healing. Sorry. I want to not worry about me getting sick. I want to make sure that my family is like, can you imagine just not having to worry about the people you love getting unwell? And you just go to hospital and just be like, ta-da.
Yeah. Would you privatize your healing ability? Like, yeah, a couple of quid.
Very wonderful, and I would necessarily be private about it. I think I would tell people I was. I wouldn't mind if no, I wouldn't monetize it.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. It's very honourable.
And obviously, some people who read The End of Men, they're going to be eager to know, like myself, when they can expect book 2 from you. Do you know roughly when that's going to be?
I don't. I truly do not know. I'm not being kind of vague. I really don't know. I mean, I've written 2 drafts of it, so it's kind of like well on its way. But that is the kind of thing that is out of my hands. But I would hope not too far in the future. I'm not going to go off and kind of need like a decade to write the next.
It's not going to be like a 27-year wait, and we're like, come on, Christina.
Okay, amazing. We're going to have to wrap up, and I'm so grateful that you came and blessed us with your blessed with guests again, Chris. Keep saying this. Always blessed with guests. And on Friday we have Melanie Blake on the show. It's going to be a whirlwind of a show, I imagine. But please do go and check out that book and get it pre-ordered and all that good stuff. And Christina, all I can say is thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
Guys, again, as always, stay safe and support the authors that support the show. Weirdly, today's me plugging it again. And we will see you on Friday. On Sunday, I'm going to be on a show on Sunday. On Monday, we're back again, and on Wednesday next week. So it's a real full, busy schedule. But all we can say is thank you for joining us, and thank you for listening. And we'll see you very soon. Guys, check out the book.
Highly recommend it. Go and get it. Go and pre-order it. It's out soon, very soon.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
We're still live.
We're still live. It's apparently not turning off. So you've got us an extra few seconds, I believe. Brilliant.